I'm pleased to introduce Olga Wilhelmi from the National Center for Atmospheric Research. She's got a lot of things in common with folks around campus and a lot of different parts of the CCPO-ICAR seminar series that we touch on with hazards. In particular, she has interest in kind of weather, climate, and societal implications and developing like applied science. She runs that program at NCAR, where she's a project scientist. She has PhD in natural resource science from University of Nebraska-Lincoln and MS as well, and a bachelor's, or I should say diploma, I think it is, in geography from Lomonosov State University. And with that, I think we'll turn it over to you, Olga. Thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can everybody see it okay?
Looks good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, thanks again for inviting me. I'm very happy to participate in the seminar series and to share some of the work that I'm doing on weather and climate risks and some of the work that we're doing on how to understanding and reducing the risks from weather and climate. So in this presentation, let me see if the slide works. Okay, so quick outline for my presentation. So I'll start with a brief introduction. I don't know how many of you know about NCAR or about the work that we're doing. I will have a few introductory slides about societal risk and vulnerability to weather hazards and climate change. And then the second part of the presentation, my colleagues at NCAR in a couple of universities on the East Coast and Utah State universities to look at the risk perception and risk communication of hurricane storm surge, where we use geovisualization and the constructs of the Centerplace constructs. So I might just take a pause after the first part just to make sure that there's no questions, and then I will go into the second part about this particular project. Okay, so quick introduction about the NCAR. So some of you may know, so NCAR, National Center for Atmospheric Research. So we're not a government agency, but we have many government sponsors. And the work that NCAR scientists are doing is really focusing on understanding the Earth system. And not only the atmosphere, but also the connection of the atmosphere and the ocean, the land, and even the sun. And better understanding of these relationships allow us to better serve society by providing the predictive capabilities and applications that are needed by the range of different stakeholders to prepare for extreme weather events and also to plan for the future climate. So about 50 years ago, NCAR founder Walter O. Roberts, he said that it's wonderful to have the opportunity given us by society to do basic research, but in return, we have a very important responsibility to apply that research to benefiting humanity. And this really has been a guiding principle of a lot of work that's been done at NCAR. And this particular kind of idea has been re-emphasized in the new strategic plan. So science in service to society has been a guiding principle for addressing and tackling some of the large scientific problems, societal challenges, and it has been renewed as the science, technology, and society evolve. And so there's also growing interest in generally in societally beneficial, interdisciplinary, and convergent research among different organizations and individuals. And many of you probably have seen some of the reports from the national academies that talk about interdisciplinary research, about convergent research, and the most recent one talks about the next generation of Earth system science and some of the recommendations for the NSF, for the National Science Foundation, which is one of the main sponsors of NCAR. And so with all of that in mind, there really has been much more focus on thinking about how to work across different disciplines, how to work on research that is societally relevant, has deep integration across disciplines, involves stakeholders, and also promotes innovation and discovery. And so I work in the Research Applications Laboratory, which is one of the UNCAR labs. And it also emphasizes not just science for society, but also science with society, which also implies working across disciplines, across social science, physical sciences, and spatial sciences. So speaking of spatial sciences, so I lead the UNCAR GIS program, and the mission of this program is to advance spatial data interoperability and knowledge sharing with GIS. And over the years, we've been doing actionable and convergent research. We use geospatial analytics, geovisualization. We engage with different communities and stakeholders, but most of the work is really focusing on how do we integrate weather and climate data with geographic information systems, and how do we bring different conceptual models together, atmospheric data models from social sciences, from traditional GIS applications, to make the weather and climate information much more usable for a diversity of different applications, and also to integrate different, very diverse data sets, again, for all kinds of different applications and looking at a number of different hazards or climate change. We talked at the beginning of the meeting that we also have a capacity building and GIS focused education element in our program. And so I definitely invite you to visit our website, like the address here. And a lot of the workshops and training programs that we do focus on interdisciplinary geosciences, focusing on science policy interface, and how to bring all those diverse data sets and diverse concepts together to facilitate preparedness, response, or adaptation to weather and climate. So my personal research focus also has been interdisciplinary. So on this graph, what I did, I just took my publications and I created a little visual out of them. And so I'm a geographer by training, and so the geography is really interested in the interconnectedness in the world. And so as you can see here, I worked on started working on drought and GIS remote sensing, but then recently really expanded my work working on extreme heat and health, various topics related to urban and coastal flooding, looking at the integration of atmospheric science with GIS, looking at more kind of the technical and scientific aspects of different disciplines, and more broadly thinking about theoretical constructs of risk, vulnerability, resilience, and more recently, convergent science. So a lot of the examples I will be using in my presentation today are informed by a lot of this work. So you will see some examples from heat and health, from the coastal applications, from visualizations, and how do we really think about how to bring all this diverse data and the disciplines together to address societally relevant questions, whether it's disaster preparedness or public health concerns about climate change and so on. So moving forward with my presentation, so I wanted to kind of start saying that, why are we concerned about weather and climate, or weather hazards and climate change? So what we've seen, over the decades, and especially the last several years, is that climate and society are co-evolving in a manner that can put more people at risk from weather-related hazards. And so this graph, it's a graphic from NOAA from this year that shows the billion-dollar weather and climate disasters that took place in 2021. And so when we look at the historic data, the last few years actually have been historic, because the number of billion-dollar disasters just in the past several years have been more than double than the long-term average number of billion-dollar disasters in the US. Many of them are hurricanes and coastal hazards. We also have a lot of severe weather in the Midwest. Wildfires and drought in the Western United States. We've seen the change in seasonality of wildfires. We have a wildfire burning right now in Boulder County, just a few miles from my home and just half a mile from UNCAR Mesa Lab. And so we're really looking at the changing landscape of the climate extremes and weather disasters. What is also concerning is that not only the number of those disasters are growing, the cost is increasing, but also many of those costly disasters happening with the backdrop of extreme temperature, rising temperature during the summer season across large portions of the United States. We also see very persistent poor air quality during summer months, either from wildfires or from the anthropogenic conditions. And also, what is also concerning is that many of those disasters may be happening either at the same time, but in different locations, or they happening consecutively, where this, giving people very little time to recover and to prepare for the next event. Or some of those can be even correlated. And so there is a growing interest in understanding the compounding disasters, whether they're concurrent, consecutive, or correlated. And, we are also interested in that particular phenomenon is that because weather-related hazards can combine in different ways to compound the risks to the infrastructure, human health, security, and safety, and potentially produce some new and emerging vulnerabilities that we haven't really thought about before. So when we think about the risk of weather hazards, climate change, we really understand the risk as the intersection of environmental conditions and social processes. So when we think about the risks, those could be different levels of different types of adverse effects, could be losses, could be health effects, but those are really the product of the hazard. And again, the hazard could be the single or compounding hazards, the way they interact together, vulnerability, which includes sensitivity and capacity, and exposure. And so this could be people, structures, ecosystems, assets. So depending on the scientific inquiry or societal relevant questions, those could be different. So, but also what's important to understand is that this risk is very dynamic. It's being influenced by environmental changes, short-term, long-term, whether it's land surface characteristics or climate change, and also a very broad, diverse range of socioeconomic processes, which could be demographics, development, governance, risk management, land use planning. All of those things come together to affect either vulnerability or hazard or exposure. So in my work, I spend a lot of time thinking about vulnerability. And so this graphic is from the Forest National Climate Assessments from the Human Health Chapter that talks about vulnerability to climate change and health. And so you can see here that older adults, low-income communities, children, communities of color have been vulnerable to climate change, in particular with regard to the health effects. But even outside of the health, public health research, it's also becoming evident that there is a systemic vulnerabilities, especially in the under-resourced communities. And again, those who are income, have housing instability, energy insecurity, health inequities, many populations that have these characteristics that consistently vulnerable to the effects of weather hazards and the climate change. So vulnerability, just to quickly define it, the way we define it is just the degree to which a system is susceptible to or unable to cope with adverse effects of climate extreme weather and climate change. In addition to the systemic vulnerabilities, I mentioned there could be some emerging vulnerabilities, either due to some of those compounding hazards or some of the changing conditions in processes in the societal dimension. So extreme heat is one of the weather hazards, again, where I've done a lot of research, and we've been really thinking about a lot, not only what contributes to heat health risks and what contributes to heat vulnerabilities, but also how that vulnerability can be reduced and what do we need to understand about capacity of the population, especially those who live in cities. What type of adaptive or coping capacity exists that can potentially reduce vulnerability. When we think about all of these different factors, again, we have factors related to sensitivity, exposure, capacity, all of these different factors, if you're thinking about building statistical models or spatial models to represent all of those phenomena, we need to think about, how also to integrate diverse data. Some of this data can come from environmental or measured data, sensing or numerical models or observed data. Some come from the census variables and the data that's been routinely collected about communities and populations. But the capacity information is a lot more difficult to understand, and those include household level knowledge, attitude, practices, household resources, social capital, and specifically social networks or social isolation, which is very important in the context of extreme heat, and also different community resources and risk reduction programs that can help either reduce vulnerabilities or make some communities more vulnerable if these programs don't exist. And depending on the intersection of all of those different factors, the way to think about reducing potential negative impacts from extreme heat is to think about, what types of adaptation and response strategies would be most appropriate. It could be targeted warnings, it could be community-based programs, public health outreach, assistance, and long-term urban design and land use change. But kind of the bottom, but the kind of the takeaway message, there's, a lot of very complex information that, can be considered when we think about heat health risks and thinking about, how to represent the data and what kind of information put together in modeling future and present risks is not something that can be done very easily. So I mentioned compounding hazards, and heat again is one of those hazards that can compound with other environmental stressors, for example, air pollution. So in the work that we, me and my colleagues have done in Houston, Texas, and Harris County, which is shown here, we looked at outdoor heat, but we also looked at indoor heat as well, and the interaction between extreme heat and ozone and how that particular interaction can affect the health risks, especially health risks of older population, 65 and older. And so in this work, again, we used some of those, extreme, the risk frameworks where we look at the exposure, both indoor and outdoors. We're looking at different factors of vulnerability, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity to understand the health risks. And this indoor environments in particular, it's more challenging because we just don't have a lot of measurements in indoor conditions. And so that's where there's been, very collaborative project between atmospheric scientists, building scientists, social scientists, and epidemiologists to not only look at some of the ambient conditions, which we can get from observed and model data, but also look at some of the building models and observations inside the buildings to help us understand the interactions between indoor and outdoor environment, about the occupant behavior, how people interact with their indoor environments, whether they use air conditioning, open windows, how much time they spend indoors versus outdoors, what other factors may be at play in terms of their sensitivity and coping capacity, how frequently they have power outages. All of those factors can be used to build statistical models that can tell us, where there's higher risk in the city to heat-related morbidity and mortality, especially here in this case with the older population. So again, the takeaway message from this research is that the socioeconomic conditions matter, the building environments matter, and how people interact with their indoor and outdoor environment can also affect how they how those risks can be distributed. In a more recent project, we looked at the compounding effect of extreme heat and the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this project, we wanted to understand how the pandemic affected the extreme heat risk experiences, risk perceptions, and coping strategies and behaviors of the US population. Again, bringing this risk framework in this context, we're looking at a combination of heat and pandemic, and looking at how some of the economics, policies, healthcare, preparedness and response, would be affecting the distribution risk. And in this work, we wanted to look at not just the typical socioeconomic or environmental factors, but also look at some of the factors that were specifically related to the pandemic. And so in the first year of the pandemic, in the summer of 2020, when we conducted the nationally representative survey of the US population, we found that about a quarter of the US population experienced at least one heat-related health symptom. 15% reported feeling too hot in home, 13% had decreased productivity at work. And many of these outcomes were because people found more difficult to leave home and go to an air-conditioned place. There were, if you remember, the first year of the pandemic, we experienced the economic crisis, so a lot of people lost incomes or lost jobs. They were home isolated, and because of the kind of they had a harder time getting adequate medical care because they were worried about COVID-19 infections. And so interactions of all of these factors also showed that some people they had difficulty to cool their homes even under normal circumstances, but during the pandemic, some of those resources that were put in place to help most vulnerable populations and communities, they were affected by the lockdowns, by the shutdowns of the related to the pandemic, and just the limited resources because of some of the economic conditions also prevented people from cooling their homes at the capacity that they needed. So again, the kind of this interaction of two different hazards just showed that, where do we see some vulnerability, how fragile our infrastructure is, if, could be easily disrupted and put even more people at risk. So now switching gears a little bit, we'll be talking about the coastal environment. And again, coastal environment also is very complex, a lot of different interacting processes between environmental and societal dimensions. And over the last several years, we've been looking at the research related to storm surge, hurricane-related storm surge, and how it affects some of the more vulnerable communities along the US coast, especially the East Coast. A lot of times, when people think about hurricanes, they think about the wind, but the storm surge accounts for nearly 50% of hurricane-related human mortality in the US. And even though the hurricane forecasting has been improving over the years, and sometimes we have nearly perfect forecast of the storm of the track. This is an example from the Hurricane Irma from the 2017. But the storm surge is still very difficult to predict. So there's a lot of uncertainty related to storm surge. It depends on the storm size or the location, on the characteristics of the coastal environment. And so again, there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to prediction of the storm surge. Most of the people have to make decisions about evacuations at least 72 hours in advance of the landfall. But given this uncertainty about the storm surge forecast, sometimes the reliable forecast can be issued maybe 24 or even less fewer hours before the landfall. And so with all of that, when we think about the storm surge forecast, there's different ways of represent this information communicated to the public. So in this graph, you can see that there are a lot of maps and other visuals I used, and not just in one way, but there's many ways that people map and communicate the storm surge forecast visually. So this is the same storm, which was Hurricane Matthew that took place in 2016. And it's the same hurricane, but there's, the information is presented in a very different way. Some is probabilistic, some more qualitative, some quantitative with different levels of detail. And, but we don't know how this information is actually being perceived by the public and whether that helps to make decisions or not. So we had in a self-funded research where we wanted to explore this topic in particular and how do people interact with information, especially when this information is uncertain. So what we learned from this work, and as the hazardous weather approaches and arrives, evolving and uncertain forecasts can interact with societal information flow and decisions. So you start, from few days to 12 hours, there's more and more certainty in the forecast. But again, as I mentioned, usually people need to make evacuation decisions much sooner than when the forecast becomes much more precise and with reduced uncertainty. So in this work, we've done work on storm surge predictability, looking at the agent-based modeling in terms of trying to understand evacuation decisions of the population. But we also wanted to know how people perceive information, whether it was in 2D or 3D environments. And so we conducted a number of focus groups, and whether it was 2D images or the 3D visualizations that was just playing a minute ago. And what we found is that sense of place and personalization of information is very important. And some of those aspects help people interpret and respond to visual risk information. But we also found that sense of place or place attachment also plays a role, but it's complex and can interact with other factors as well. And so in the follow-up in the CEF project, we also wanted to explore this idea of sense of place and visualizations a little bit more in depth. And so in this project, we wanted to combine the aspects of geolocalizations, risk communication, and coastal hazard due to storm surge with a focus on the place and sense of place. And there's an overarching goal to understand how the sense of place constructs embedded within geolocalizations of storm surge can influence people's understanding and responses to storm surge risks. So this work is being conducted in Georgia and South Carolina, and it has multi-method research design. So we started with the cognitive mapping focus groups. Then we created the visualizations, embedding some of the concepts that we learned from those focus groups. And then we tested those visualizations in the survey of the coastal residents in Georgia and South Carolina. So I'm just going to show a few examples. Again, this is a work in progress, but I wanted to share this research because I found some interesting results. So the first of all, what we mean by cognitive mapping. So the cognitive mapping is basically help us understand what do people mean when they talk about their community, about their place. How big are their community? Is it a neighborhood? Is it an island? Is it a county? It depends, whether people live in a rural area or urban area. And also, what is meaningful to them? What's important to them? As you can see here, people initially are focus group participants. We just were writing down, we love climate, we love art, we love specific places because they're meaningful to them for different reasons. And then we asked them to put all of those different places on a map to get a sense of the scale of the community and how far those places are, and how close they are to some of the vulnerable areas that would be vulnerable to storm surge. So this particular work then informed development of what we call the sense of place typology. So all of those entries that our focus group participants provided, we geocoded, and using some of the previous literature on place attachment and sense of place, specifically focusing on place identity, attachment, independence. So we basically condensed all of those different categories into a number of constructs that represent people and social connections, natural environment, heritage and culture, economy, recreation, religion and spirituality, food, aesthetics, essential services, and infrastructure. So then all of these kind of concepts, having those in mind, we designed a series of visualizations for a fictitious town that we called Kilo. And the reason we wanted to use a fictitious town, because since we were doing the coastal survey, we didn't want to bias any particular community with information that that somebody is deeply familiar with, but other people would not be familiar with. So we wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page and everybody received the same information of this fictitious coastal town. And then we created a hypothetical storm surge forecast, and we varied representation of those sense of place features and constructs by incorporating the places that we derived from the focus groups in anthropology. We modified the scale of information, dimensionality, and also abstraction and realism, how to present this information in an abstract and realistic way. And then we selected several of those visuals for the experiment where it was embedded in the survey. So I'm going to go quickly through some of those maps to illustrate what we mean by some of these ideas. So this is a map of our fictitious town called Kiel. It has a couple of other neighboring towns. It has a few highways here. And so this was our control map. So this is the type of maps that people commonly see when they receive the storm surge forecast. It doesn't contain a lot of detailed information. It just has the most basic information, place names, town, like locations for different towns, and maybe major highways. And that's about it. And it also has information about the coastal flooding at different levels. So that was our control map. The second map had the same information, but this is where we're starting to incorporate some of those. Again, they're fictitious places, but they represent things like people and social connections, economy, recreation, natural environment, basic infrastructure, and some religion and spirituality, and just as a sample of different locations that may be meaningful in the context of a community or a place. The third map still contains all of those different places, but it also has the several photos that depicts not only the different flood levels, just showing exactly how high the flood water may be when we talk about 6 to 9 feet, or 3 to 6 feet, or 1 to 2 feet, but also has a visual representation of some of those places, whether it's shrimping or a church or a supermarket. Again, giving this a little bit more kind of emotional affective view at the potential impact of the coastal flooding. The fourth map shows, again, I mentioned modification and scale. So here we're providing a zoom in location, and I forgot to mention that this yellow dot is hypothetical home of the, the survey respondent, which we say we're located in this place. So we have a zoomed in place with different street names and building footprints. Now we're increasing dimensionality. So this is a 3D image, but in an abstract representation where we can show the building heights and water levels next to those buildings. And the last one, again, the 3D image, but more realistic with actual trees, buildings, and the flood levels. And so those visuals were included in the survey of the public, as I mentioned before. So we wanted to understand how those different ways of representing the space and place would influence people's understanding and responses, and what other factors may play a role. So the survey was distributed during the summer of 2020. It was quarter-based sampling. We used Qualtrics to collect data. And the survey was, we received close to 1,500 respondents from Georgia and South Carolina, from the zip codes, and all of those zip codes has potential flooding from category 3 and 4 and 3 and 4 hurricanes. So now just a little bit about experimental design. So half of our respondents received the visuals where their home was located in a flooded area, and half of them homes were located in a non-flooded area. And by incorporating the house in a non-flooded area, but close to the flooded area, we also just wanted to explore a little bit, how people feel, how certain this information would be, and how would they perceive their risk if they were located in one condition or the other condition. So the survey also had questions about previous experiences, the information sources, sense of place measures, Then participants were randomized in this experimental condition. We have 6 visuals for 2 different locations. And then we also have questions on risk perceptions, predictive behavior. We also asked questions about state preferences and some other key measures, including demographic, cultural worldview, and some other questions. So I'm only going to show a couple of results. But what was interesting when we asked people about the state of preferences, and so here I have all of my 6 visuals with the home located in a flooded area. And so the question was, which of these figures is most helpful for you to feel like you can relate to this information, quickly make sense, envision yourself in this place, understand the risk of flooding from storm surge, and also deciding what protective action to take. And so what was interesting to see is that this third condition, this 2D map with the photos, was by far the most helpful for people with regard to some of those points. And our map with the abstract inset map, the 3-dimensional abstract map, was the least helpful. And so in terms of statistical significance, when we look at the state of preference, this particular option was most helpful to understand the risk from storm surge, make sense of information, and also envision self in this place. So now we wanted to also look at how those defensive visuals affect the respondents' risk perception. This particular question was part of the experimental design. So there were a number of different risk perception measures that I don't have on the slide, where we did not see any statistical significance between the visuals. But what was interesting in this situation, one of the risk perception measures was exposure to storm surge, specifically the likelihood home will be affected by flooding due to storm surge. And so we did see statistical significance between the control map, which was our basic map without any labels or images, and the map that had the labels in the photos. And so basically what we saw is that people who saw to this particular map, these photos, were significantly more likely to think they will be affected by flooding due to surge than people who saw the 2-dimensional control map. We also wanted to look at the role of experience, specifically prior experience, on how people were selecting some of these variables. And so what we saw is that, again, there was significant effect of experience with flooding in community. There were several other questions: experience with property damage, experience with emotional distress, but most significant effect was the flooding in community. And so basically, people who don't have experience with flooding in their community were more likely to think flooding due to storm surge would happen when they got the map with the photos and the labels. And so kind of take away home message is that visual helps people who don't have experience to better understand the risk and visualize that risk. So all of this, again, I mentioned ongoing research. So we're still analyzing this data and integrating all these different concepts and ideas from expertise from different disciplines, and integrating research from sense of place, from risk perception, risk communication, geovisualization. But again, the preliminary results shows that showing the photos, showing the labels, help people, especially those who don't have prior experience with flooding, to better understand the risk and to make sense of information, and really kind of help them to really visualize and envision themselves in a particular environment. But of course, there's going to be a lot more future analysis where we bring together the visuals, the place attachment measures, the risk perception, and several other demographic and socioeconomic factors as well. And especially, we're interested in looking not just at the risk perception, but intended behaviors and response behaviors. So that is really the end, what I wanted to present about this project, and kind of give you a general overview of the different research that we're doing. As I mentioned, there's the lot of work that we're doing at UNCAR in the RAL Research Applications Lab and in the GIS program that integrates atmospheric, social, and spatial sciences. And when we focus on weather hazards in society, that's where we can really uncover a lot of nuanced details about exposure, vulnerability of the hazard, especially the compounding effect of the different hazards. And the coastal hazards are really complex, and that's where we really see a lot of different compounding effects from the wind and flooding, and which can also be followed by water pollution and extreme heat and air pollution, especially in indoor environments in a situation where there's disruptions to the food, energy, or water infrastructures. And so, again, all of this work has to be very collaborative, just because we bring it together people from different disciplines. I wanted to acknowledge my collaborators on the project that's focusing on storm surge and Centerplace, from UNCAR, from University of Georgia, from University of North Carolina, and Utah State University, and also the funding from the National Science Foundation. So with that, I will stop. I hope we have plenty of time for questions, for discussion. I put my email here. If anybody has any follow-up comments or questions after this seminar, please feel free to email me. And also, again, here is just the website for the GIS program. If anybody's interested in either in some of the data that we're distributing or in the training programs, I invite you to visit and contact me if you have any interest in the future. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you. Oh, yeah. Yeah, excellent integration. And we do have time for some questions from the audience.